Hi, Mary Helen Guest families. This is Mrs. Canner and my daughter Madeline.
Hello.
And we're going to be reading you Ribsy, the first half of chapter 4.
Ooh.
Ribsy becomes a mascot. The Hugginses had received a number of telephone calls in answer to their advertisement. A man had seen a dog that sounded like Ribsy running down Broadway, but he did not know where the dog had gone. A lady had been feeding a stray spotted dog for over a month, and she would really like to get rid of him. A boy called to say he knew a couple of dogs that sounded like Ribsy, and how much was the reward. Another lady called to say she didn't know anything about Ribsy, but she did have 5 perfectly adorable puppies, and she would be glad to give Henry one. It was late in the evening, after the advertisement had been running for several days, that Mr. Dingley, the father of the 4 girls and George, telephoned to say that he had read the notice and that he was sure it must have been Ribsy his family had picked up in the parking area at the shopping center. He told the tale of finding Ribsy, of the bubble bath, and of Ribsy's disappearance into the dusk. He was sorry he had not called sooner, but 3 of his children had come down with chickenpox, and he had been busy. Bubble bath! Henry was disgusted when his father had relayed the story to him. A bunch of dumb girls giving Ribsy a bubble bath? For Pete's sake! No wonder he ran away. At least we know the direction in which Ribsy went, said his mother. That's something. Well, let the ad run a while longer and see if it won't bring results, said Mr. Huggins. Bubble bath, muttered Henry. Bubble bath! By the time the advertisement had run for 3 weeks, the Hugginses had received several more calls and gone to look at 3 different dogs. None of them was Ribsy. Well, Henry, I don't like to say this, said Mr. Huggins at last, but I think we might as well stop the ad. Henry nodded. He could not think of anything to say. He was sure Ribsy had to be someplace, that someone must have him, but that someone quite plainly was not going to answer an advertisement in a newspaper. And why should he? Ribsy was such a good dog, anyone would want to keep him. By now, Ribsy was back inside the city limits. He had learned from his own neighborhood on Klickitat Street that many people fed their pets outside the back door or in the garage. This made his search for food fairly easy as he continued his journey. He had only to investigate backyards, and sooner or later his nose led him to a dish with a few crumbs of food, or, if he was lucky, to a whole bowlful. Unfortunately, most of the people whose yards he passed through kept cats. He gulped down several meals of rather fishy cat food. Workmen eating lunches out of lunch buckets were another source of food. Workmen tearing up the streets, workmen repairing telephone wires, workmen putting new roofs on old houses. All of them were glad to share a corner of a sandwich or a bite of a donut with a friendly dog. Hunger was not Ribsy's problem. He was no longer sure of the way toward home. None of the streets he followed seemed to lead to Klickitat Street. He searched for something familiar, something that would lead him home to Henry Huggins. He trotted along the sidewalk, looking up at all the people he met, hoping that one of them would turn out to be a member of his family. They were always strangers, but Ribsy was not easily discouraged. He continued his search until he came to a mailman waiting for a bus. Ribsy, who had often followed the Klickitat Street mailman on his rounds, was delighted to see someone who looked a little bit familiar. He pranced right over to the bus stop and wagged his tail. "Hello, Pooch," said the mailman. Encouraged, Ribsy sat down beside the mailman, who obligingly patted him. That, as far as Ribsy was concerned, was that. He would follow the mailman, who was sure to lead him to the Hugginses' house. When the bus stopped and the mailman swung aboard and sat down, Ribsy scrambled after him and flopped down at his feet. "Hey," said the driver, "that dog can't ride on this bus." "He's not my dog," said the mailman. "Somebody get him out of here fast," said the driver. "I got a schedule to make." A high school boy was glad to help. He seized Ribsy by the collar and pulled. Ribsy stiffened his legs and dug his toenails into the floor of the bus. He was not going to go. The boy pulled so hard at his collar he began to choke. "Don't you hurt that poor dog," cried an old lady from the back of the bus. "Take your hands off him this instant, or I shall report you to the SPCA." The boy let go of the collar. "Wait, I have an idea," said the mailman. He slipped the strap of his mail pouch off his shoulder, got up, and walked quickly down the aisle. Ribsy was not going to be left behind. He trotted right down the aisle and followed the mailman out the rear door of the bus. The mailman then surprised him by sprinting to the front door and jumping into the bus once more. Before Ribsy could jump in after him, the door was shut in his face, and the bus drove off in a particularly smelly cloud of exhaust. Ribsy had never had a mailman treat him this way before. He did not know what to think. At first he tried running after the bus, but the smell of its exhaust soon discouraged him. He wandered along the sidewalk until he saw 3 girls carrying brown paper bags. Instantly, Ribsy's spirits rose. Here was a familiar sight. Girls with lunches and paper bags were sure to lead him to school, and there he would find Henry. He followed happily along behind the girls, just close enough to catch a whiff of their lunches. Tuna fish, peanut butter, and pot roast. That pot roast sandwich smelled delicious. "Don't look now, but there's a dog following us," said one of the girls and giggled. The other 2 thought this was very funny. They all giggled and glanced back at Ribsy, who trotted along, minding his own business. Sure enough, just as Ribsy expected, the 3 girls led him to a familiar place, a 2-story red brick school, surrounded by a fenced-in asphalt playground. His spirits rose even higher. Henry must be around somewhere. After noticing that the 3 girls left their lunches on a bench before they went off to play hopscotch, Ribsy put his nose to the ground and ran around the schoolyard, searching for the scent of Henry Huggins. He picked up many scents of boys and sneakers, but none of them had the exact scent of Henry. Ribsy also picked up the scent of the pot roast sandwich. Once more, and this time he helped himself to the lunch bag. There was no use letting a perfectly good piece of meat go to waste when he had eaten so much fishy cat food lately. "Look," squealed the owner of the pot roast sandwich, "that dog has my lunch." The chase was on. Everyone, boys and girls, big and little, chased Ribsy. He loved it. He hadn't had so much fun since he had been lost. He ducked and dodged with the brown paper bag in his mouth. Sometimes when he was far enough ahead, he dropped the bag a second and stood panting with a laughing look on his face, as if to say, "Catch me if you can." Then, when someone almost reached him, he snatched up the lunch and ducked and dodged some more. Finally, the yard teacher blew a whistle that hurt Ribsy's ears, and everyone stopped chasing him. "Here, doggy," coaxed the yard teacher. "Nice doggy." Ribsy eyed the teacher warily, ready to run if she should decide to chase him. Instead, she approached him slowly with her hand extended. "Nice doggy," she said. "Give us the lunch. That's the boy." She was so friendly, Ribsy let her pet him and take the lunch. "The poor dog is hungry," said the owner of the undamaged pot roast sandwich. "I'll give him something out of my lunch," said someone said, and a dozen lunch bags were opened. "Now, children, you know dogs are not allowed on the school grounds." The yard teacher spoke in a mild voice because, after all, Ribsy was such a nice, friendly dog. No one seemed to hear her. Ribsy found himself being offered pieces of sandwiches, potato chips, carrot sticks, raisins, and cookies. He accepted the most appetizing bits to the delight of the givers, while those who bought their lunches in the cafeteria petted him and wished they had something to feed him. Ribsy could tell he was going to like this place. When the bell rang, Ribsy went right into the school with the boys and girls and into the nearest classroom, which happened to belong to Mrs. Sonchek's 2nd grade. He looked around the room at the desks and blackboards and at an empty aquarium on a ledge below the window. None of this was especially interesting to him. Then he walked into one door of the cloakroom at the back, sniffed the lunches and wraps, and walked out the other door. Satisfied with his investigation, he flopped down near the cloakroom door and laid his nose on his paws. He had spent the night dozing in a cold garage, and was glad of a chance to nap in a warm, dry place that smelled pleasantly of sneakers, lunch bags, and boys and girls. The 30 boys and girls of Mrs. Sonchek's second grade took their seats, while Ribsy dozed off. Suddenly, he was awakened by the sound of 30 pairs of feet sliding out from under their desks and 30 boys and girls standing up. Everyone was going someplace, and Ribsy was about to be left behind. He jumped to his feet too. "I pledge allegiance," began the class, "to the flag of the United States." They were not going anywhere after all. After the flag salute, the class sat down, all but the 2 boys nearest Ribsy, who petted him in such a way that Ribsy knew he had somehow pleased them. A girl raised her hand. "Yes, Penny," said the teacher. "Mrs. Sonchek, there is a dog back here, and when we stood up for the Pledge Allegiance, he stood up too." Penny was pleased to have announced this news to the class. Everyone turned in his seat to admire such a smart animal. "It must be a very patriotic dog," said Mrs. Sonchek pleasantly. "And now, Danny, will you please take him outdoors?" Reluctantly, with several backward glances, Ribsy allowed Danny Yaxley to lead him outdoors, where the asphalt was cold and unfriendly after the warm floor of the schoolroom. Ribsy looked sadly at the door that closed behind him, and the minute the milkman came to deliver the boxes of milk cartons, he slipped inside, returned to the second grade room, and flopped down by the cloakroom door. Penny waved her hand. "Mrs. Sonchek, that dog is back." "Keep quiet," whispered the boys. Mrs. Sonchek merely said, "The dog is not bothering anyone, Penny. Pay no attention to him." Mrs. Sonchek did not like to waste classroom time. There were so many interesting and important things to learn in the second grade. That was how Ribsy became a member of the second grade. He spent his nights in garages whose owners had left the doors open. In the morning, he went to school with the neighborhood children, who fed him bits of their lunches and, in a day or two, began to bring him an occasional dog biscuit. When he was thirsty, he had only to go to the drinking fountain in the schoolyard, and some boy always turned it on for him. After he had managed to lap the spurting water with his tongue, the boy usually had a drink too. Following the flag salute, when he was sure of being petted if he stood up, he dozed all morning, going out at recess with the rest of the class. At lunchtime, he got in line and went to the cafeteria, where he finished the sandwiches of those who asked him to, except peanut butter sandwiches. Sounds like you. These Ribsy would sniff and politely refuse. Peanut butter stuck to his teeth. After lunch, he lay at the back of the room with his nose on his paws, waiting for school to be out so that he could play with anyone who wanted to play with a friendly dog. It was a pleasant life. This had gone on for several days. Then one day at lunchtime, Ribsy lined up as usual and went to the cafeteria. He was very well behaved, stayed with his class, and sat down beside a table where Mrs. Sonchek's bad lunchers were eating while the rest of the class lined up to buy their lunches. He was licking the remains of a crunched up potato chip from the floor when he became aware of a man standing over him. "And who is our friend?" asked Mr. Woody, the principal. "A dog," said Bill Amato. "A nice dog," said Penny Moyse. Ribsy was pleased when the principal stooped to pet him. "Whose dog is he?" asked Mr. Woody. "Search me," said Peach Lickman. "He comes to school every day. He lives around here someplace. See, he has a collar." He pointed to the red collar Mrs. Frawley had bought for Ribsy. "I know," said Mr. Woody. "I have seen him. Perhaps he belongs to someone who is away at work all day. From the fancy red collar, I would guess he belongs to a lady." "Oh, please let him stay," begged Penny. "He's an awfully good dog. He even stands up for the Pledge of Allegiance." Mrs. Sonchek's bad lunchers nodded. Ribsy wanted to please this man, so he held up his left paw. Mr. Woody smiled and shook hands. "Well, fellow, I see you are a southpaw." Ribsy, always glad of attention, stood up and wagged his tail. "It looks as if Mrs. Sonchek's room has a mascot," said Mr. Woody, "as long as he behaves himself." Mrs. Sonchek's bad lunchers beamed at the principal. "Our mascot is always good," said Penny earnestly, and the others nodded. The week went smoothly until Friday arrived. Friday in Mrs. Sonchek's room was show and tell day. It started like any other day. Mrs. Sonchek looked around the class and noted that Danny Yaxley was absent. Ribsy stood up with the rest of the class for the flag salute and then flopped down for a nap. "Does anyone have anything to share with the class this morning?" asked Mrs. Sonchek. Kathleen Adelson came to the front of the room to show off her doll, which had a pair of real little sunglasses. The boys looked scornful. Pete Schlickman showed a tool chest he got for his birthday. He said his mother would not let him use the hammer or saw in the house. The boys looked interested. They wished they had tool chests too. Philip Gorberg had just finished telling about the time he was riding down a hill with his father and the brakes of the car refused to work. When the door of the classroom opened, Danny Yaxley came in with his mother, who was carrying a sheet of corrugated cardboard and a wooden box with holes bored in the sides. It was a rule in Mrs. Sonchek's room that anyone who brought a pet for show and tell had to bring his mother too. The mother's job was to take the pet home. "I'm sorry we're late, Mrs. Sonchek," said Mrs. Yaxley, who looked as if she had not taken time to put on her lipstick. Danny insisted on bringing his squirrel for show and tell. The cage was too big to carry, and I had to stop and bore holes in this box, and well, I'm not very good at boring holes. All the boys thought this was funny. They were sure they would be good at boring holes. All right, that's it for tonight. Stay tuned for the rest of chapter 4 tomorrow.
Bye.